Welcome, everybody. I am Monica Bock. I'm professor of art and art history here at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Art and Art History. I actually was hired as the metals professor and taught metal casting and ceramics for a number of years, and then really focused back in on ceramics, which was my first area of study and expertise. And I'm actually going to have us jump right in. Oh, hi, Blanche. Oh, I love chat. I can actually see folks coming in. I'm sorry that I can't see you all. I love the back and forth, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat. This is going to be a very simple approach. And I think what I would like to do is have us start right away just making something, pinching basically the T-bowl forms, because we will need to let them set for a bit. And I actually we have a bathroom in the ceramic studio that is hot all the time. The heat is always on, even in the summer. And so we use that as our hot room. One could use a hair dryer or heat gun, although it's a little tricky to get the heat even in those cases. But I think if we start by pinching a pot and then set it aside, I can kind of do a slideshow I have on Japanese ceramics with a focus on T-bowl forms, and then we can come back and do our rims, our feet. So I actually ahead of time did some very simple forms, and you'll hear when I give my little talk that this kind of sort of simplicity and sort of understated humbleness is typical of the Japanese aesthetic as it's associated with the tea ceremony and tea bowls, or chawan as it's said in Japanese. So I have a few different shapes here, and I've left the bottoms, each a little bit different, and the feet a little bit different. And this is sort of the first rough form. And I will get back to this when yours hopefully have set up a little bit. If they don't, you can look at the recording later and finish these after yours have set up some. But initially, of course, clay is very plastic and flexible. And then as it dries, it gets closer to what's called leather hard, which makes it possible for us to do a lot of carving or trimming, as it's termed in ceramics, with metal trimming tools. You folks have a knife, a spoon, fork. I have a ceramic knife, but a pottery knife called a fettling knife. But I'm going to do everything with just these tools, since that's what I assume that you were able to get. I actually don't have a flatware knife. I have a paring knife, but that's okay. We're not going to need a knife, honestly. This is the most simple approach to making pots. So I actually have a bunch of clay wedged up into 1 pound balls, 1 pound and 1.5 pound. You have a big block of white clay. Mine is red terracotta. These are low fire clays. It has iron in it. That's why it looks so brown. When it fires, it looks like this. What camera am I using here? Brick red. That's our school clay, basically. And so that's what I'm using. When it dries, it'll be kind of, dry and crackery looking. And so it goes from this leather stage to the dry stage, and then to the bisque stage when it's fired once. So what I'd like to do first, your bags of clay, they are what's called pugged. They're de-aired at the company where they're made. You have a low fire white, so it's the same low temperature firing clay, but it doesn't have an iron in it, so it's whiter. It's white, and I did that so that hopefully you wouldn't be worried about messing up your home environment. But we make our own clay. So we have raw materials, and we, big bags of raw materials, and we have recipes, and we have a big clay mixer. Well, it's not so big. It makes about 150 pounds at a time. And that clay is not very well aerated because we actually have a pug mill, but it's so hard to, it's such a pain to use that we don't worry about it. We hand wedge our clay. And I just want to show you quickly the Japanese method of wedging. It's actually called spiral wedging or kikuneri, which is chrysanthemum wedging. And we always do this with our fresh clay because we need to compress it, we need to get air out of it. And it is just a nice thing to learn to squish your clay together, because all the clay that you have, you can reuse. Even if it gets too dry, you can put it back in the bag and, you know, put some water, a significant amount of water on it, and it'll rehydrate. But there's a couple different kinds of wedging. This is the regular wedging is just like kneading a bread, but it's called ram's head wedging because when you wedge it up, it looks like a ram's head. But the Japanese method is a little different. It's one-handed, and it creates a kind of conch shell at the bottom. And this is really handy because you can wedge large amounts of clay because you're really only wedging this little triangle up here. You're kind of twisting it on itself and making a little smear with the lower part of your hand, with this part of your hand. And this is very fresh clay. It was mixed just a couple weeks ago. Clay is best usually when it's aged for a year or half a year. So some Japanese potters will put their clays in their clay cellars and leave them for years before they use them. So because aged clay grows a lot of microbes, that helps it be more plastic. But in any case, you get this kind of beautiful look. And all the air bubbles that might be in the clay get squeezed out in these little folds. You can see a lot of crackling here. That's partly because it's not as aged, but it's not a problem. It's just the way it's splitting under pressure. And it's very easy also to roll this up using the table into kind of a nice log. You can either put that on the wheel and start throwing, or you've got a nice log for working with. So I didn't have you get a wire or anything. You don't need to wedge, as I say, because it's de-aired. So you can just take the rubber band off your bag and peel the bag back and expose, some material on the top. And I weighed mine out because, I know that I wanted to sort of get a sense of how much each of these tea bowls would be, which is, as I say, between a pound and a pound and a half. But your hands, I'm assuming there's some kids in the audience. I have long hands, where is my camera? I happen to have really, these hands work very well for pottery, long and thin, and for kind of reaching down and pinching pots. You may have smaller, shorter fingers. So what I want you to do is take a ball of clay that seems to be, a good size for you. That can kind of, maybe it's a baseball size, maybe if you're 3, which you may be, it might be a golf ball size. So depending on your size and age, you want to get comfortable. And actually, I'm going to give you the link to there's a beautiful video. It's in Japanese, but it's on YouTube. But it's beautiful to watch, of a raku master pinching out a raku bowl. And you can see that he's teaching people how to make sure that the bowl basically fits in your hand like this when it's done. With this sense of one hand under, one hand over. So starting off with a ball that fits your hands is probably pretty good. Actually, let me just see what weight this is. I'm going to back off a little bit. It's a little over a pound. And there's a couple different ways you can do these. The raku tradition, which is all those bowls are handmade, and I'll show you, they're not thrown on the wheel. I'll show you some pictures later. They start with more of a kind of a pancake, like a, not even a pancake, like a bun. But I tend to like starting with something more round. And I'm going to show you two different ways of doing this. One that creates more of a thick bottom, that leaves a thick bottom so that you can carve a foot in the bottom. And one that is even all over. So this is the same thickness from lip to bottom. And I'm going to add a foot onto that with a little coil, which I did earlier there. And I'll show you that shortly. It is handy, and you'll often see people will have like a lazy Susan type thing. But again, I'm interested in having you not feel like you don't have the equipment to make stuff. So you don't have to have a lazy Susan. They're easy to make. This is actually a homemade. They're called banding wheels. Actually, this is a banding wheel. It's a little bit worse for wear. They're usually metal. And they have rings, concentric rings. So they're handy, but you can make them if you get those kind of ball bearing lazy Susan parts and screw them onto a piece of wood. You can just make these. But again, you don't absolutely have to have these. So you want to make sure that you wrap back up your clay. So the clay that you're not using, you want to wrap back up, close your bag up. And often we think about clay as, ceramic work as having a lot of water involved, but actually water can be a problem. It can overwet, it can make things too slimy to actually respond to your fingers. So once you have this ball in your hand, I'm just going to have you push your thumb down in the center. And then I guess I would have to say this is the tricky part. It's squeezing, where's the camera? Squeezing between your fingers and your thumb. And if I keep my thumb in a curve like this, the interior is going to be more curved in the bottom. If I point my thumb more straight, I can make more of a corner there, right? So that I can create this kind of square look. And right now I'm going to do this thing, which is more rounded, but also it leaves quite a thick bottom. So whether hand building or throwing, a lot of sort of working with clay, or certainly this kind of pressure and counter pressure. I can't push on this without my fingers also pushing back. Otherwise, I'll just either push through the clay or it'll get too big too fast or whatever. So there's a pressure and counter pressure. But there's also being able to kind of sense how thick things are, right? So right now, my thumb and my finger are about maybe 3/4 inch apart. And I want to maintain that. I'd like to have a 3/4 inch bottom so that I can carve on it later. Okay, so I'm going to move this around on my palm. And I do a little bit of pressure against my palm, but there'll be more so when I do a thin bottom. Right now I'm leaving a thick bottom, so I'm working more on the walls. And I'm basically, it's a little hard to see, but I'm starting at the bottom and moving up to the lip. And I'm also sort of stopping right before the lip. I'm still going to thin the lip a little bit, but I don't want to do this, right? I don't want to pinch my lip too thin. I want to keep an even lip. So I'm going to come up to the lip and kind of tuck under it with my thumb. This clay is actually, I have two lumps of clay here. One is rather soft. It's very fresh mixed, and we kind of mixed it a little too wet, I'd say. Whoever did it, I know who did it. It was a student, left a little too much water. Once you have sort of too much water in clay, you just have to let it dry. But it also makes it easier to move. And I was making a bunch of these today and my thumb was starting to hurt. So I'm switching to the softer clay. Okay, so what I'm doing on the outside, I'm thinking about the fact that I want to put a foot here. So I'm using my four fingers, right? To kind of delineate a foot. Whether I'm throwing or hand building, if I'm talking while I'm making something, it's never going to be as good as if I'm really there with it, paying attention. So already this is really splayed out, and I'm going to sort of do that on purpose. I'm going to go ahead and let it be a thin and more open bowl. And I'm not even too worried. You can see that I don't know if you can see, but the lip is sort of cracking a little bit. That's okay. It's just this surface skin. It's like stretch marks, right? They're splitting a little bit. Those can be absolutely beautiful, actually, after the glaze is on them. But I can also take those off later if I want. But I'm not going to fuss too much at this really wet stage. There's a lot I can do after it's set up. All right, so I have this kind of knob here that's going to be a foot later. You'll see when we talk about Japanese tea bowl parts, and you actually, I believe I sent, you may have even seen it from the information I sent earlier, but there's always a little bit of a pool at the bottom for the tea. So there's kind of an indent down here, get out of the shadow. I'm not too worried about that right now, but I can put that in a little if I want. I want to be careful though, because I don't want to make this too thin, because I want to put a foot in there later.
Professor Bock?
Yes.
We have a question. What is the advantage to having a foot on your bowl?
Oh, that's a very good question. So it's aesthetic, partly, because, let me get a sample. A foot, first of all, especially, these are thrown, not hand built, but especially if you're a thrower and you're looking at pots, say at the fair, you know, the art fair, the first thing you're going to do is turn it over and look at the foot, because the foot is actually the real finish of the pot aesthetically, and there's all different kinds of shapes. Then the kind of aesthetic thing that it does is you see how they sort of float? So instead of sitting like a lump, right down on the ground, like this guy, it's just down there, right? This one is kind of floating. There's that shadow underneath, right? The other thing is that most Asian handles are not necessarily, or the kind of handles we think of as on mugs, they're not really a thing in traditional Japanese, Chinese ceramic. So it's really important to have a foot, not so much in tea ceremony, because the tea ceremony tea is not hot necessarily, it's not so hot. But the bottom of this pot is called the place that touches the tatami, right? So there's this whole kind of emotional thing about what the foot touches your hand, touches the tatami, the rice woven mats in the tea room. But also, so for non-tea ceremony cups, so these are teacups that are for just regular tea. They're called yunomi. Let's get in this picture, yunomi, which means nomu is drink, yu is hot water. Hot, yu, hot water. So if you have a teacup full of really piping hot tea, and you must have had tea like this at, you know, restaurants, Japanese, Chinese restaurants, this gets pretty hot, which can be okay. If it's a thin porcelain, it's a problem. But here you have a foot that's not going to get hot, and you have the rim. And so, you know, you'll often see people holding their tea like this, right? So that you're not touching the hot sides. So it's functional, right? Because it just doesn't get hot, and the rim doesn't get hot because the hot water's not up there yet. So these are for regular tea. But also they're just really beautiful, and they're all different. So, you know, this is a bizen. I'm going to talk a little bit more about bizen. This is hagi. These are the towns in Japan, different towns in Japan.
Monica, another question. Does the shape have to be round?
No, I'll show you lots of different shapes. I would say, you know, a wheel is a machine for making round things. So they usually are round initially, but then they can be altered quite significantly. And I'll show you a bunch of different shapes. So here's one. This is a pot that from my first teacher in Hyde Park, actually, a guy named Hardy Schlick. And it, of course, it cracked. And if I was a good Japanese artisan, I would put gold leaf in there, put gold paint in there. But so this one's not really round. It's kind of round, but its rim is shaped a little bit differently. Here's one that's also thrown really softly and then distorted. But you can paddle, absolutely, you could paddle these square. I think for tea ceremony, you know, you're thinking more about function and the kind of gentleness in your hand and the way it touches your lip. So they're not necessarily angular, but you'll see some different shapes when I show you some pictures. For pinching, for this kind of pinching and this kind of sensitivity of pinching that you learn doing this, they're likely to be round initially, but of course I could alter this, right? And those are soft. This is really soft clay, so those corners are soft right now. But once this is harder, I could paddle this square, sure, right? And I would do that before I let it set up too much, because it'll get too stiff to move after a while. Okay, and I'll just put this aside. So that's one. Any other questions so far? Advantage of the foot, does the shape have to be round? Okay. I'm going to take another softer, I'll just take it out of here. So this is clay that I wedged up earlier. It actually was a mix of the really fresh stuff and some older stuff. So it's a little stiffer. But I'm going to make, again, to pinch a bowl that's just completely round and smooth all the way around. It's a slightly different. Actually, let me just do one more thing before I go on. So this is kind of an open tea bowl. You might even call it Natsu chawan, summer tea bowls. A summer tea bowl tends to be more open because you don't have to keep the heat in, right? A winter tea bowl tends to be closed more like this, keep the heat in. This is more of a summer tea bowl. And, you know, they're usually kind of tapered up like this. I could make this a more squared bottom just by using my thumb to kind of push out and create a more of a square profile. Hard to see, and I can't really change that now, but that could be an option.
About how thick are the walls of your pot?
What'd you say?
About how thick are the walls of your pot that you just made?
The one that I just made is actually rather thin. It's almost too thin. It's very floppy because I was talking, so it's about a 1/4 inch. For this size, it's a little big, it's a little floppy. I would rather leave it a little thicker so that I can go in and trim it later, carve it later. So these are more like, you know, maybe 3/8, a little thicker. This one is another one that I would put a foot on and I would carve. So once again, I'm going to make this one a little straighter. I put my thumb in. This time I'm going to try to not have it splay out so much. And I'm going to just be very conscious of starting from the bottom and pulling up, pressing up. So I'm kind of, let's see, turning my hand. So push, push, push from bottom to top of the pot. So bottom to rim. Where should we be by now? Wherever you want to be. You could still be working on the first one. I'm just showing you two sides, two kinds. In fact, you may well be, if you're a beginner, you could still be pinching your first pot. That's totally fine. So in this case, I'm going to use my palm much more this time because I want my bottom as thin as my walls. I'm not leaving a thick bottom to carve into. So I'm using my palm. And I'm pushing against it, starting from the bottom and then moving up to the lips. Right? My palm is offering counter pressure and support and shape into which the ball is fitting. So this is a little taller. And, you know, again, my thumb is pretty long. I can get down to the bottom of the pot pretty easily. And, you know, again, these are not wheel thrown pots. This is not really about a machined look. This is the simplest way of making a pot. The refinement can come in, some refinement can come in the carving after it's set up.
Hey, Monica, if it cracks, should it be smoothed with water?
No,
Okay.
don't put any water on. If you feel like you need to smooth it, just use your thumb, because water is only going to supersaturate your clay. So clay is, the reason why clay is clay, the reason why it's plastic, the reason why it holds its shape, is that at the molecular level, the particles, the particulate level, they're flat like platelets. And the water adhesion holds them together and they kind of move. And they get more and more compressed as you work on them and organized. And if you add water, you start to make a slush in between those and they slide more and you just lose it. So water is not your friend actually in ceramics. It's necessary in throwing initially, but I throw very dry after the first centering stages because I don't want to get my clay all waterlogged. So you can see that my thumb, just dry, I took all those cracks out. But I can also do that later. And they aren't really cracks, they're just stretch marks. If you're really cracking like all the way down the pot, your clay is probably a little too dry. But you can't really just wet it once it's made. You would have to re-wet it and ball it up and put it in the bag and, so that it gets evenly moist. So once I have one of these guys, and again, these are really fast and humble. At this stage, I would probably let it set up a little bit, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you what I did to make this guy. So instead of carving in a foot, which I'll do in a second, I'm going to add a foot. Oops. So I'm down here kind of rounding the bottom with my fingers because I'm feeling against my palm. Let's see if I can get you to see this without shadow. There we go. I'm kind of going in and I'm pushing against my palm, the curve of my palm, to sort of make sure that I'm actually pretty much the same thickness from the center of the bottom all the way around that lower belly portion right in here, which you'll see when we look at, that's where the whisk is used to whisk the cha, the tea, powdered tea, the tea ceremony. Okay, so what I need to do now is make a little ring. And again, this can be kind of rough. Later you'll refine it. Let me take my nice pots away. So I just grabbed a little wad of clay. I'm gonna make a little snake. You can either kind of roll it between your hands, pinch it out. It can be quite a round snake, or it can be a little flat. Make a kind of a taller foot. And I'm gonna, yeah, I think that's about what I want. So here's where normally, when we're working in the studio, when we're doing handwork, we have slip, which is just clay that's been dried and then saturated in water. It's usually old clay that's been used. And then we plunge it. So we have this slurry, looks like chocolate pudding. It's clay slurry, it's clay that's been resaturated into liquid and actually plunged with like a, what do you call those? A food processor, handheld food processor thing. But you don't necessarily need that. If you folks had dry clay, I would have you make a little slurry by just putting a little water in a cup and shaving off some, dried clay into it. It's really hard to make slurry out of fresh, wet clay. It just kind of sits there in a lump on the bottom. So I'm actually going to say we don't need it. I'm going to have you just take a little bit of water on your fork. And let's see more or less where this is. And I'm going to just kind of make slip on sight. I'm going to slurry that up. And you want to be gentle because, this is pretty wet. If I had a little more time, I would let it set up a second. Get a little stiff on the canvas. I have a canvas covered board here. You either have a piece of cardboard, maybe working on a piece of cardboard, which is fine, or just a wooden board like I have here, whatever you have. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm actually making some nice slip on the end of this fork. So I'll kind of use that. Okay. And I'm going to sort of squeeze that on there. And I like to see a little bit of slip scooch out from underneath it if I can. And then because this is pretty soft, I'm probably going to distort the bottom a bit. I can't wait too long because I don't want to let this dry and then try to put a wet foot onto it because clay shrinks when it dries. So all those platelets, when the water evaporates out from underneath them, down here, evaporates out from underneath them, they compress, they get closer and closer together. And of course, when it's fired, then they actually fuse and become glass. But there's shrinkage involved. And this terracotta shrinks, it's a little more than 10%. So I need to make sure that these are pretty close. A piece added like this is pretty wet, pretty much the same wetness as the bowl. Okay, and then I'm just going to use my dry thumb. Hopefully this didn't get too wet. If it did get too wet, wait a second. You could even touch it with a little towel or paper towel. But we don't want a whole lot of wetness here because we need a dry thumb to move that. See, there was water there, so it slips and doesn't move it. I really want
Professor
to
Bock,
move
did
the
you
foot.
wet both the bottom and the ring?
What'd you
and the
say?
foot? Did you wet both the bottom and the foot?
Yes,
Like
but like barely. All I did was I dipped my fork in and kind of knocked the water off. I don't want to add too much extra water because the walls are already pretty thin. So just get a little water on your fork, and I can smear it from the inside, and then I'll do this on the outside, and I'll do the same on the inside. I could put my hand in if I need to some counter pressure. This is actually a little too wet. My first one was easier to handle because I wasn't as aggressive with the water. So I might let it sit a minute and it'll help me move it a little better. Okay, so in this case, I've already got quite a bit of a foot, both the interior of the foot here and the exterior. But I'm still gonna, this is like the rough hewn version of the pot at this point, right? So I'm gonna actually go ahead and put these two that I just made in the, give me a second, I'm gonna put them in the bathroom next to our heater. And what I'll do is I actually put it on the board, and these are wet still, so I'm gonna put them all in there. And you notice I turn them upside down on their rims, partly because it's thicker on the bottom, and I want that to get dry. So if I turn it over, I'll get more evaporation from here, and I won't get so much evaporation from this really thin portion that I don't want it to dry too fast. Of course, the board and the cardboard are going to absorb some water also, but I turn them over so that I can get them stiff there. So these are the two pots that I made. I probably made these maybe almost 3 hours ago. They were probably done by 3. So you can see how much stiffer they are from having sat in there. If I squish this now, it would literally break. It wouldn't squish, it would crack open because it's stiff. It's a little, I can't really move it without cracking it. This one pretty much the same. And so, when you get to that stage where it's resisting you, right? I can make a finger mark if I squeeze really hard, but it's stiff. I can't move this so easily. Then I'm getting close enough. This is a soft leather hard. I'm getting close enough to being able to trim it. Now, normally, when you trim a foot, and I'm going to show you all kinds of beautiful feet when we look at the video. So you don't have to do this immediately. You could wait, not the video, the slideshow. You wait till we look at those. But you could also just do it, since you probably get the idea of what a foot is. But these are Japanese kana. So these are the Japanese style trimming tools. And they're just pieces of metal that are stiff, very stiff metal that are cut and bent so that they're blades. And they're really good for carving. You don't have that. You have a kitchen knife, which is okay. It's kind of flat. That'll work. You could even try a serrated one, like a regular dinnerware knife. You can see these have different shapes. So look at the end of this one. It's kind of got get closer. It's kind of got a curve on it. And so, obviously that's handy if you want to sort of get into, say, that curved area at the bottom of the foot. When we trim on the wheel, the sort of Western style, we use these loop tools or ribbon tools. And I have a ton because I like all these different shapes. Oops, sorry, I'm not using my camera well. You see? All different shapes for trimming on the wheel. I could use these here. They work too, definitely for hand work as well. But I'm gonna actually try to do this with a spoon and maybe with the other end of the fork. Because I'm assuming that's all you have. I've never trimmed with a spoon, but I think I can make it work. So at this stage, you know, the clay is, as I say, it's kind of resisting me. It's more, it's gonna be more like carving leather, right? So all I'm doing is kind of working through and watching what I'm doing and watching the profile of the pot. So I might decide that I want this foot to have kind of a, let me get the profile in here. To have kind of a curve that tucks in. So I gotta find what portion of this spoon will do that for me. Some of this is soft enough that I could even still use my hand. And this is the stage where you put some music on or an audiobook, and you just work it until you're done. If this, so raku clay in particular has a lot, this is a throwing clay with no, it's just clay. It doesn't have any aggregate, doesn't have any sand or what's called grog, which is refired. And it's fired and ground up bisque clay, once fired clay, that can be put into to give something a little tooth. This one is just gonna be very smooth. And there'll be no particles that I'm pulling out. I also have a soup spoon. See if I maybe like that shape better. I can either decide that I want this portion of it to be real smooth and to carve out all those finger marks, or I can leave that and just work on the foot. See if I can move my camera a little closer. A little better? You're not going to be able to do this for a while. You can go ahead and put a coil foot on if you want. It's good for it to dry up together. Oh, and by the way, this also doesn't have to be round. I could have made that a triangle or a square. I also could have just put a slab on instead of a coil, make a little solid bottom. I need to be careful and aware that I can't dig too far right here or I'll dig through my pot, right? I don't want to go through and make a hole. And in fact, if it's a real tea bowl, it should have a little pool in the bottom for the tea, which actually pushes out. And so I may even push. You can see now there's actually a peak here. Tea bowls also often have a little point in the middle right there. It's named after, it's the Japanese name, it's in my talk. It's named after a cap that ascetics wear, rustics wear. But anyway, this is soft enough that I could, work on that shape. If you have trimming tools, I think I mentioned, as an optional thing that you could get one of these cheap sets of wooden tools. Wooden tools aren't quite as useful for trimming, but they could work too. If you have these, you can carve with these. Okay. And I can use my board too if I want to make sure It's flat on the bottom, and I could go back in and work that some more. You know, if you find that you don't want to finish this right now, you can grab a piece of plastic and wrap it up fully. As long as this is wrapped well, it'll last pretty long. If you were going to, if it was feeling like it was just getting a little too hard, you could mist it. Don't spritz it, don't spray it, don't saturate it, but you could kind of use one of those misters, like for plants, and put it on the mist and kind of just let a little bit of water fall onto it. You see that? If this pot was here. That's even too
Professor
much.
Bock,
Yeah.
how long should they be letting the pots dry for?
It's going to take a while to get to carve stage. So in my hot bathroom, it took 2 hours, almost 3 hours. Yeah. So what I would suggest, if you have 5 pounds, you can make a whole bunch of these balls, 1 pound balls, and just make a bunch of them. Make one pot after another. Maybe you could make 5 of them even. And then put them someplace to set up. So your foot should go on, if you were going to add a foot, your foot should go on pretty soon after you've made it. You might let it set up a little bit. But it's going to take a couple hours to dry probably. If it's raining here, so unless you've got your heat on, it's also really humid out, so it takes a little longer. If you have some heat, like if you're near a heater, don't put it directly on the heater, but you could put the board, you know, nearby. If you pinch a spot too thin, is there a fix? You could try to grab a little bit of soft clay, and I use spit. Actually, spit's very good because it's got microbes in it, and it helps helps the clay any added clay sort of eat back and forth and adhere better. But you could patch it. Yeah, you can do that. If the whole thing has gotten crazy thin and you just feel like you've lost control of it, just wedge it up and make another one. But yeah, if you have a part that seems too thin, I would use your fork and, you know, do a little bit of scoring and then take some wet clay and squish it in there. You need to make sure that it's really well adhered. But don't add a lot of water, because if it's thin, the water's going to soak right through it and make it even weaker. But yeah, you could patch some little spots. Okay, so that again, I would sit here for hours doing that. When I wheel trim, I don't take hours, right? Like if you're on the wheel, you turn when you make your pot, you turn it over and you use these as it's moving on the wheel. It's adhered down with little pieces of clay, and you're moving pretty fast and you're making these shapes. But in this case, you know, you're working the whole thing. And in fact, you could go in and work the lip too. And you've got some pretty inefficient tools because you've got spoons that don't have blades on them. But you kind of need that roundness, so. You know, just work it till you feel like it's the shape it's the surface you like. You can take
Mr. Bock,
yeah.
Can you let it dry overnight before you carve it? If it's not dry enough later tonight?
I would wrap it up. So what I tell my students is never leave a pot unwatched. If you're trying to get it to leather hard, it'll probably be too dry in the morning. So leave it out, and then before you go to bed, or before it gets to, before you go to bed, wrap it up real tight, like I showed you, and come back and do it tomorrow. And it may still be too wet in the morning. That's okay. Put it out, do something else. Keep coming back to it and pinching it and see if it's the right, the right stiffness. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so the other possibility, so this was the one where I didn't add a foot. I just left, I left extra clay on the bottom. And I kind of have to be aware of how much is there. It's probably, might be a 3/4 inch there. So in this case, I'm going to be carving the whole foot, both the outside and the inside.
If it gets to be too dry, can you sand it?
If it gets to be too dry, no. So you, first of all, you can, you'd have to make the foot first. You can't sand in a foot. That wouldn't work. It would break. Also, clay is mostly silica and alumina, and silica dust is not good. So, you know, we don't breathe in enough silica. We will never breathe in enough silica to really get silicosis, which is, you know, it's a carcinogen. Silica dust is. Miners get it, you know, potters don't get it. But you really don't want to be creating a whole lot of clay dust. If you do want to just sand the surface, I would wear a dust mask. And also what's better than sandpaper is drywall. It's drywall mesh. You've seen that? I'll get one and I'll show you what it looks like. You can use that more as a refiner, but it's not going to get too dry because you're going to wrap it up and you're not going to let it get too dry. It's called moisture management. It's actually the sort of biggest deal with clay. Is kind of always being aware and paying attention. And you can moisten it, you know, you can keep moistening it. Sometimes you could also put like a damp sponge next to it. You don't want to put it on it, but you could put it next to it, and then put plastic down on a board, put the pot there, put a damp sponge next to it, and then wrap the whole board with plastic, and then you've sort of made a damp room for yourself. So this is really rustic. But I'm basically carving out a foot. And of course, this is quite thick. And you know, you might like a kind of heavy pot. You do like it to be even though. So if it feels heavier here, if it feels sort of bottom heavy, then you know, you're not only going to be taking away the foot, you might be taking away some clay. In this case, I kind of like the outside, so I may go in and dig from the inside. We never usually trim the inside of a pot on the wheel, but it's done. The traditional raku ware, it's done all the time. So you can go in and kind of thin it that way. It's like I'm carving a pumpkin, like I'm getting the guts out of a pumpkin. All right. All this stuff that you pull out, you could let that dry and then throw it in a cup of water or like a Tupperware of water. And actually, you could even throw it in the way it is. It just takes a little longer to get, you know, to really disintegrate. But that can make you some slip to work with later. All right, so do you see the difference in the process? One is an added foot, and one is a takeaway foot, negative process, a subtractive process. Even when I've added a foot, of course, I'm doing some subtraction, right? I'm going back and carving and cleaning. And in this case, I made a point of leaving that little peak in the middle. And I can do the same thing I did before and kind of make sure that pool is there in the bottom for the tea. Professor
Bock, when doing this only by hand, what's the best way to get the walls smooth if you have limited tools?
Time, if you have a spoon. So, you know, between a knife, let's see. basically, if you can see what I'm doing, this is another thing you could do. You could actually run your fork over it, and you can kind of see, you see where there are places where the fork doesn't make a mark. That's a divot, that's a lower point, right? So I could do that where I sort of make striations and then go back in with my spoon. As it becomes increasingly, stiff, it will resist the tool a little more and it'll be easier. Keep in mind that especially in Japanese aesthetics, smooth isn't necessarily better, especially if you have an opportunity to glaze, because all those hand marks are really lovely. They take glaze in different ways. But you see, so I got that pretty smooth. And then I went back in and I used my thumb to kind of burnish. Right? So the difference between, oops, if I push a little too hard on the inside, I'm getting cracks. If I do get a crack like that, that's a problem. So I do want to take some of that slurry, wet, kind of wet clay. And I always add spit, pardon the spit. And really mush that clay in there, because I need to make sure that I'm not just smoothing over the crack, it'll come right back. I need to get inside.
One more question.
Yeah.
Do you have to carve out the middle of the foot?
Not necessarily. However, if you think about the fact that clay shrinks, you probably need to do some at least shallow. You'll see some feet that are really, really shallow. The problem is you don't want a big, thick 3/4 inch bottom just here, like just right in there where the foot is, and then thin out here, because this then will dry much slower than this, and you'll have a tendency to get cracks. When you throw, you'll see S cracks. They actually look, I think I have one. Yeah. Can you see oh, it's too white. Can you see it? Kind of an S crack in there. Right there. It's so white it doesn't show. There we go. So the idea of sort of uniform, especially this kind of clay, the clay you have, I believe, is throwing clay. It has no aggregate, as I mentioned, and so it shrinks a lot, and it doesn't have any aggregate in it to help it dry quickly or uniformly. So you need to have kind of more or less the same thickness everywhere. And if you leave a big wad of clay under there, it can be a little challenging. You could just put a little impression. They could be shallow, yeah? There's all kinds of different feet that you can make. So that's basically the process. It's we can't fire these. You can let them dry. Dry clay, this could be painted with acrylic. It won't, you can't put water in it. It probably would peel off eventually. But if you have access to a ceramic studio in your neighborhood, you could sometimes get, you can usually pay for kiln space and get them fired. But you could also just have it, as an Adobe ware. It will certainly, hold like stains. So you could even get Minwax, like wood stain. That's more likely to stay on than acrylic, but they have to not be too wet, right? So just thin, dry layers, so you don't oversaturate. Yeah. So in one of the pictures I'm going to show you, you'll see that the person uses what's called a trimming harp, which is just a flexible piece of bamboo with wire in between. And that can be used, especially if you have a banding wheel and you feel like you want to make your top, you know, even. I really prefer the kind of unevenness of my rims. And so I tend not to use this or a pin tool, but you could just use your knife even, if you can sort of get yourself, you know, at a uniform height. You could even mark it, you know, measure the height and mark it. If you feel like you don't like that pinched look on the top, and then you can just soften the edges, you know, keeping in mind that this is going to be against someone's mouth. If it's not going to be functional and, you know, if you're not going to drink out of it, you could actually make any sort of lip you want. You could even be, you know, an angled. And I'm moving really fast here, so it's going to be completely uneven. You know, and it would have sort of a sharp edge. And that can be interesting. Right? If it's not going to be a tea bowl that you're going to drink out of. All right. So that kind of rim work you can also do later.
What is the traditional wall thickness?
A traditional, it really depends on the function. So, and the style. I'll show you some examples, but they go from thin to like, you know, it's an aesthetic choice. They're usually thinner than this. This is still about 1/4 inch in most places. And I could, you know, I would trim that down either or pinch it down initially when I first made the pot. Yeah. I wouldn't say, there are so many different styles. Actually, let's go ahead and look, if you don't mind. I'll put the slideshow on while you keep working. Do you have to carve out the middle foot? Yeah, I just saw that. You could keep working, you can keep trimming while we look at some pictures, and you'll see the variety of tea bowls. They're really, it would be hard to say, you know, that there's one style. I mean, you know, Japanese ceramics, you know, I would say that the kind of the earliest kilns when they were really established were like 600 AD. And the Middle Ages, the 12, like Bizan is really identified as Bizan by 1200. But, you know, this is like many, many years of making stuff. So the variety is intense. So let me just put this aside for a sec. Maybe I'll turn off my, unless there's any more questions about making. Any other questions about making the pots? I'll maybe turn this one off and then we'll just look at the main screen then. Okay. So why don't I go ahead and share screen? I feel like there's still, are there any more questions? Q&A. How do you pinch it taller without pinching the circumference larger? Oh, I do have that option, just a small. Okay, I'll make the tilt better. Actually, that's a good question. Was that answered, how to make it taller? I think I did it the second time, but I'm gonna go ahead and I'll just show you one more time. Let's see, I'm gonna just do it right here. It's just this question of, instead of pinching out, pinching up. So I go all the way to the bottom and I just really make a point of kind of pulling towards myself. Straight up from the bottom. So that second pot I made was taller. Yeah. And that, you know, that process of kind of pulling from the bottom rather than letting it spread is how I would do that. the yunomi, I would probably start with less clay also. So these are all 1 pound balls. You could get a yunomi, a tall, thin drinking cup, teacup out of ½ pound. Yeah. Does that answer? Okay. So let me get to the share screen. Let's see. And oops, hold on. Before I do that, give me 1 second. Okay. And I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Huh. It says my screen share is not working. Lauren, let's see. Lauren, did you give me,
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
share my screen? It's asking me to share. There we go. Did that work?
Yep, we can see it now.
Okay, good. Let me close this. So I think there's a, oops, I'm sorry, I accidentally touched the questions when I meant to close them. So there were a couple questions that I missed. If you would please re-ask them in the chat, that would be great. So are you seeing the slideshow or no? There we go. Okay, just, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I just want to show you, to situate yourselves in the world. This is Japan, obviously. The 4 major islands. Hokkaido is up north, cut off there. Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. And then you can see this long list here. Those are the kiln sites. So there's 41 in this set, and there are 6 ancient kilns that kind of the very earliest sort of established pottery towns. And I'm going to talk a little bit in depth and show you some pictures of one of those, but it's Seto, Echizen, Tokonoma, Bizen, Tamba, and Shigaraki and Iga. So they're named, largely after the towns. Let me get my cursor over here, and I'm going to get a laser pointer. The little map I'm showing you here, it's 2 parts of the map from the Japanese Pottery Handbook. And I was for 2 years in Tokyo on a fellowship and was interested, I'll talk a little bit more about that, was interested in ceramics. So I began to explore nearby, and there's 2 very famous towns near Tokyo, Mashiko and Kasama. Mashiko was so famous, it was almost cliche. For a bunch of reasons, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's a great, very interesting town. But I was more interested in Kasama, where there were more variety of contemporary ceramics going on. All of these towns have antique ware that sort of is typical of their town. But then often there are younger potters who are doing a little bit more contemporary takes on that. I also was, I spent 2 years living in Tokyo and a 3rd year living in Kyoto. So when I was in Kyoto, I was closer to Shigaraki, which is a wonderful pottery town where the clay is just a beautiful light orange with lots of quartz in it. And also Bizen, which is one of those first 6 in the town of Imbe. And it's very famous for reasons I'll show you in a second. All of these kilns, basically they're established where the clay was, right? So they all have very different clay. and very different styles. So that determined where a lot of these kilns happened. These are some of the books that I drew from for this talk, but also that got me through Japan. I went to Japan with this book, the Japanese Pottery Handbook, and this book, Earth and Fire, and also this one, but this is much more historical. These were the guides that really helped me wander around Japan. And Kasama was one of the first ones I wandered to. This is a newer, this is a tea ceremony book. It's very good. Lots of information about tea ceremony if you want to look into that more. Oh, the two books, the Japanese Pottery Handbook, this is the original, which was completely hand drawn. This is, you can't get these anymore. They're very, I think this was $72. It's a paperback, but it was like 72 bucks on Amazon. This is 20 bucks. It's the new version, has a lot more kind of print, some of the old drawings, but a lot more typeface. So not quite as nostalgic, but very nice, useful, very useful. So just very quickly, that's me when I was whatever, 20, 26, 25 in Kyoto. But this is the group that we were called Shanxi reps. I went to Oberlin, and first year grads, so people who had graduated just for one year after they graduated, or seniors could apply for Shanxi repships, and that's me in the middle. We all went to different places. That's actually now then my boyfriend, now my husband. He went to Sri Lanka. I went to Japan. Frank went to Korea. A couple people in India. So we went all over, and it's Oberlin Shanxi still exists, and actually mostly it's for Oberlin students, but there are other fellowships there for going to Asia. This was the Himatsuri in Kasama. That's a big kiln that's temporary. It's built just for the Matsuri is festival, the fire festival. And that is, visiting this fire festival sort of changed my life. I met this woman who was the apprentice to this teacher, Arata Koji. And Shoko, this girl here, she studied English, and so we started talking. I knew quite a bit of Japanese, but I wasn't very fluent at that point. I got more fluent over the 2 years I was there. And she made a deal with her teacher that I could come over in the long summer and spring vacations when I wasn't teaching English near Tokyo to help his kids learn English. He had 2 daughters, and be a sort of temporary apprentice. And this is me working in his studio, actually on a hand-built slab piece that's under a sheet on a plaster mound. So I'm making a little dish. This was work I did when I was in Tokyo. So after I finished my fellowship, I was teaching at Obidin Gakuen, teaching English at a sister school to Oberlin. I went to Tokyo and lived for a year on all the money I'd made teaching English to businessmen. And my husband also, well, my then boyfriend, now husband, he came to Kyoto, and we stayed there for a year. And I went to an art school called, it's a Saga art school near Kyoto. Again, just through having met an apprentice who was a Japanese American who we struck up a conversation, and her teacher then introduced me to the teacher at this school named Iwabuchi. So everything was by introduction. And so I stayed for 3 years. I did calligraphy and I did pots, both sort of Western style. This with a pitcher is more of a sort of Western style pitcher. And this is a sake bottle and cup, which was where you start. When you start learning, you start with sake cups off the hump, throwing off the hump on the wheel. And you move to yunomi, and then teacup, tea bowls, and then bottles. These are noborigama. These are the big climbing kilns. Well, these two are climbing. This one is a single chamber updraft, but these are what the kilns look like in Japan. They're brick and then clay surfaced. And this is a classic noborigama, meaning a climbing kiln. It has a front chamber, and then it has all these chambers behind it. This has a front chamber, but then it climbs up more like a snake. It's called an anagama, which is a hole. Kama is kiln. And so anagama is a whole kiln, and noborigama is a climbing kiln. And these are all wood fired. So you can see all the wood stacked up. These are all wood fired, and that wood firing creates a lot of the effects on the surfaces, especially in Bizen. So this kiln on the left is the kiln of a teacher named Isazaki Jun. And my friend, I had a very good friend from Oberlin who went on the Watson's Fellowship. She's right here, Mindy. And she went to a number of different, she just looked up people actually in that Earth and Fire book and wrote to them and said, can I come and hang out when you do your firings? And she went all the way around a bunch of different places in Japan. And I followed her to quite a few of these. So this was in Bizen. This is the big 10-day firing. In Bizen, the firing goes from raw clay to fully fired, vitrified over a 10-day period, because you start with the clay raw and you have to get it up to a kind of hardened stage, to a biscuit stage, and then to a fully fired stage. And there's no glaze. And that's partly because all of the clay, Bizen clay is basically black. It's dug up from beneath the tambo, the rice paddies, and it's so full of carbonaceous matter that it's extremely black. And all of this color that you see, the gray is ash, the red is the color of this very, very iron-rich clay, and it's this bottle would have been laying on its side in the kiln, and the ash falls and turns it gray. So all of these effects, this is straw, these stripes are straw, and the what is it? Is it the soda ash? I forget what it is in the straw, but when it burns out, it leaves these marks. And these are sake bottles with cups on top. And these are the little ladies packing the older ladies packing all of those things. But you can see in a pottery town, there is so much scrap pottery that they build their walls with it. This is piles of old pots on top of a wall that are then grown over with vines. And the whole town is, just picturesque like this and full of clay. So folks were asking about, what shapes can tea bowls be? Pots for tea. These are actually, there are a number of tools that are involved in tea ceremony. The caddies that hold the tea, the powder, the little rests that hold either the lid or the ladle, the water pots, the braziers for the charcoal that heat up the water, the big tea jars. So, there's a bunch of different ceramic and bamboo and other materials, other craft objects that are involved in tea ceremony. But the tea bowls come in all different shapes. Yeah. And as I say, usually have these feet. There are other kinds of tea. I mentioned yunomi, teacups, yunomi down here. The taller, simple teacups, that's the everyday tea, not for the tea ceremony. Different teapots. This is a classic Japanese teapot with the handle off the side. All right. So let me go on. We only have about 10 minutes. Let me go quick through. Just to show you some pictures. That's from that book, the tea book, of different tea utensils in place. You could sort of see the scale of them. This is a raku tea bowl. This looks like a hagi tea bowl. You can tell usually by the color. Hagi usually has white slip over the iron-rich clay, and then it kind of turns this beautiful orange. These are cast iron, right? The boiling here, and these are bamboo. And there's the bamboo whisk right there. And this little tea caddy, that's lacquer. It's wood with layers and layers of lacquer and gold imagery on it. And this is a piece of porcelain, blueware. So not everything in the tea ceremony is these kind of rustic tea bowls, but much of it is. It's very prized. This is a big water jar right here, probably Iga. This is the tokonoma, which is a little nook where there's always a calligraphy scroll and usually a flower arrangement. And just to show you some very simple pictures of some of the gestures, very ritualized gestures, ladling water into the tea bowl, whisking the tea, and again, the tea is powdered, it's not leafy. The finished tea, and then the host placing the bowl for the guest. And usually there's a lead guest, and then there are secondary guests, I guess you call them. These are some super, super famous teapots, tea bowls rather. And you can see that some of them are, you know, really distorted. All of these bowls have names, they have boxes, they have signatures, they're in museums, they're national treasures because ceramics is so prized in Japan. So this one's called Thatched Hut. This is from Mino. Looks like it has some slip over the iron clay, and then that, you can see how that beautifully kind of blushes the white slip that's over it. All right, so all different kinds. This is a raku, black raku bowl. And raku is a whole different process than some of the other firing methods, but and it's a very porous clay with lots of sand kind of grit in it. You can see the texture is very different. And it's the color is in the clay. Okay, so some different tea bowls. Millions of tea bowls. These are mostly contemporary tea bowls that you see there. So you can see a lot of variety. There's one of the boxes. That's a whole craft unto itself. There's in any town, there's a pottery town, there's a whole other business of people who are doing all the ancillary stuff associated with the ceramic. These are different kind of feet. So there's one that's practically a donut, right? And those are names of potters underneath them. All kinds of different carves. This one's really simple, right? So with someone asked, you have to carve the middle out. No, you could just slice through just to kind of thin it there and give it a little less weight, right? And there's one where it's not a foot at all. The bottom comes right to the edge and then drops down, but you don't have a raised foot. The bottom of the pot is the foot. And then there's just this sunken area right here. So, and here's one that's quite flat and no foot at all. So sometimes that happens too. Lots of different styles here. And then just to show you some, you know, profiles, it's sometimes easier to see the variety of shapes and feet when you see them drawn like this. And potters are always doodling this kind of thing. The profiles of the pots. This is a classic one too, where there's that open, but then that little dip right there. These are, you know, wider, flatter, open summer tea bowls. Okay. And, you know, these kinds of images are available on the web. I think this one actually is from the tea book, tea ceremony book, but this you could find on Pinterest probably. Potters are always posting these kinds of things, but it'll be available to you also. And then this is actually from the Japanese Pottery Handbook, and this is a little more refined one, explaining the different parts of the tea bowls. So an open tea bowl and a closed tea bowl. And this area here, number 4, being the tea pool, yeah? Where the tea is supposed to linger at the bottom. Yeah? And then this is the whisking area. And when they're taller, it has a frothing area. Okay. So when you have a chance to look back at this, you could kind of look at some of this language. But, you know, this is how sort of, there is a lot of sort of analysis and aesthetic and ritual and history in just the pot itself and even the parts of the pot. Remember that little bump I told you about in the middle of the foot? That's called a tokin. It's the small cap that mountain ascetics wear. Okay, yes, it somehow references the cap. So tea ceremony is rooted in actually in Buddhist aesthetics that have to do with sort of understated beauty and sort of weathered looks. Let's see. Let me go back just for a sec to this one. You know, there's a kind of a rusticness that's prized by tea, you know, tea masters that comes from these really ancient pots that were made often by, actually, there's quite a number of Korean potters. There's Koreans who were abducted by the shogun to come and make pots. And then there's others that came and set up shop. So there's a real mix of Japanese and Chinese and Korean aesthetic in teaware. So let me just quickly go through these. These are the kind of instructions for the teeples we made, except that we're not doing this. And this is really, I never actually have seen this done. I will give you a link to, I'll put it in the chat. There's a link to a YouTube video of someone working much more the way I showed you to work. I don't start with a slab. He doesn't start with a slab. They start more with a patty. We started with a ball, but this is really where you would start, by putting your thumb in and starting to squeeze up the sides. And then using, here they use the kana, but you could use any tool to continue that trimming. So you can see that it's quite thinned down. And in addition to the foot, there's also work that was done on the interior and the exterior. And that's kind of a classic teeple shape. So that's on there for when you want to go back. And then I just throw this in. You can see the cutting harp, but you can use a knife, as I showed you. I will show you when we get off really quickly. That's what you see them smoothing with is a little piece of leather, wet leather. And this is carving a foot, and this is adding a foot. So the two different kinds of approaches to making the foot are here for you to see as reminders. And then just for fun, for future reference, if we do another one of these and people don't mind just watching, there's a very particular way that the Japanese throw, which is quite different from the way the Americans throw for these cups, tea bowls, sake cups, tea bowls, and teacups. Always sort of start with this plate form, and then they're lifted up into the cup. And it's a very efficient way of throwing and very much not done in the States. I learned to do this in Japan, and that's what I teach when I teach here. And then it's cut off with a little, it's called a shipiki. It's a little string. While it's rotating, you wrap the string around and snap it through, and then you can cut it off. So that's just a taste of things someday when we have an opportunity to do another one of these. Okay, so I'll stop sharing. And just let me show you really quickly, this is the chamois. So we put them, this is just, you can buy this. This is leather, soft leather for polishing cars and furniture. You can get it at a hardware store, but you can also even use a wet strip of cloth. But chamois are nice. We tend to close them up into these, this is a film canister, if anybody has film canisters anymore. We do, because we still teach that here. But you could also put it on a cork, like pin it onto a cork or nail it onto a cork so that it floats and doesn't get lost in the water. But let me just show you really quick. I don't have my other camera on, but hopefully you can just see. If I soak this leather, and get it nice and slimy and wet, it's usually better if you have it on a banding wheel, but it's also just a really nice tool for softening the lip. And not too much water again, but this is sort of after you're done with everything. And this is actually the one I cut on a slant and has all these kind of bumps on it, marks where my knife notched it. But I can just soften that up. I'll leave the notches. They look nice. They'll catch the glaze. And I can soften it up with that little chamois. And that's it. That's everything I have for you.